Hi everyone. Nice to be here this evening. Thank you for the warm welcome. I really wasn't planning on telling you a whole bunch about my former life, but I'll say a little bit about my background just so you know what's going on. And I wrote this really formal speech, as you all can see. I was just in this building the other day for a fundraiser for a group called Village Gardens and the Village Market program. Did anybody go? Good. So I'm wearing the same outfit, so you didn't notice that. That's really good. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background and then I'll jump into what I really want to talk to you about, which is leadership. I was most recently at New Seasons Market, and I had the privilege to work with some of the best staff members that exist, I think, anywhere. One of those people is actually in this room, Dan Hanna. And I asked him if he had gotten sick of hearing me speak, and he said, never. So I hope that's your expression as well at the end of the night. So I was the CEO most recently for the last couple of years, and over the course of almost 8 years while I was there, we opened almost 12 stores and had a few more stores in the pipeline. We grew from 400 staff members to 2,500 staff members. So a big chunk of growth. And everything was going really smoothly. We onboarded an equity partner, and some of our founders transitioned out of the company, and all that was going really well. And I got to the point where I was thinking, I have this concept in mind for a small grocery store, sort of a mashup between a 7-Eleven and a New Seasons. And I've been thinking on it for about 10 years. And I got to thinking that if I don't do it now, someone else is going to do it. And I see a need in the marketplace for this concept because we have a lot of health issues in the United States, as you know. Obesity is rampant. This generation of kids, not you guys, but the ones right behind you, are expected to live less long than our generation and your generation. And all of that's due to nutrition and health. So I felt like if we could change the food landscape with these convenience stores and give people healthy options, we might have an opportunity to help change this landscape. So I left New Seasons and I started a startup. And all I can say is stupid, 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 stupid. I've worked a lot of hours in my career because I started out being a chef, and typically what happens when you're a chef is you start your shift around 7 o'clock in the morning and you go home around 11 o'clock at night. But you do the same thing more or less all day long. So while it's physically taxing, it's not necessarily emotionally taxing or intellectually taxing. But I can tell you I'm starting at 7 in the morning now and working till midnight, and I'm so completely exhausted from all aspects of my life that I can barely complete full sentences. So please forgive me for little blurbs here and there that come out completely random. So what does leadership mean to me? Your professor, I don't know, Professor Rook is everybody's professor in this room, or?
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah. So he asked me to summarize my leadership philosophy, and I said to him, can I switch mics? Sure. I prefer that style. Oh my God. Thank you. The Bob Barker style always works better for me. So anyway, Professor Rook said to me, summarize your leadership philosophy. And I said to him, I don't know that I can just summarize it in a sentence or two because it's way more than just a sentence or two. But if I had to summarize it, it would come up something like, listen for each person's kernel of truth. So let me say a little bit more about that. In order to listen to each person's kernel of truth, you have to be in a place where you are seeking first to understand, as opposed to seeking to tell people what you know or immediately try to solve their problem. And oftentimes people over the course of the last many years in my life would come into my office with a problem. And just so you know, my office looked kind of like this. I don't mean as large as this. I mean, it had no walls and it was just a desk shoved in the corner of a room. And that was very purposeful because I wanted to express to everyone that I was accessible. I'm right there, there's no walls, you don't have to make an appointment, you can just walk over to my desk. So lots of people over the course of the years walked over to my desk. And I'll give you an example of someone that was maybe a little bit out of control in their ranting and raving. And they said to me, hey, I'm on the verge of getting fired. And I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Can you say more about that? Well, I had a whole bunch of tardies, and I'm on my very last tardy before I get fired. Oh, well, why do you have so many tardies? Well, I live on a farm, and I have to feed all the animals before I come to work. And I live in Vancouver, and I have to go over the bridge, and sometimes the bridge is up. And what I think you should do is I think you should abolish the attendance policy. That was his response to being late and almost getting fired. And I said, well, that's really interesting. And I kept just using this method, which I call the method of inquiry, to get him to a point where he could see that that was a completely ridiculous proposition. And so I had the opportunity to say, well, that's ridiculous. We're not going to abolish the attendance policy so that you don't get fired because you can't get your act together to get to work on time. So rather than saying that, I said to him, well, tell me more about abolishing the attendance policy. What is it about the attendance policy that's bad? And he said, well, you don't get enough tardies and absences. And I was shaking my head saying, okay, and I'm writing it down in earnestness. And then he said, and I don't have any opportunity to get attendance credits. And so I asked him more about attendance credits. And he said, well, only the part-time people can get attendance credits because the full-time people would be in overtime. And so the way attendance credits worked in my former life was if someone needed to fill in on a shift, the part-time people would get called and they would get an extra shift if they wanted it, and they would also get an attendance credit that they could use against one of their tardies or absences. And so here's this person kind of ranting and raving and suggesting something that's a little bit ridiculous, but I was listening really carefully for the kernel of truth. And the kernel of truth was the attendance credit policy was flawed. And so then I said to him, well, you know, I think you're right. I think there is something wrong with the attendance credits because they unfairly favor some and disproportionately others. And I said to him, well, what do you think we could do about it? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, let's think about this some more. Because at this point, what I want to do is take the monkey off of my back that he just gave me and give it back to him. Because there were 2,500 potential monkeys at my former work, and I can't carry everybody's monkey around and expect to get my work done. So as a leader, it's my responsibility to help each staff member find solutions themselves. So the way I give the monkey back is by asking some more questions. So what do you think we could do about that? And he said, I don't know. I could ask a few more people what they think. And I said, oh, that sounds like a task force. Why don't you think about a task force? And he said, well, I don't know how to do that. I said, well, what kinds of resources might you need from me or the company to put together a task force? And he said, well, I need to get paid to do the task force, and so do the other people that are going to participate. And I said, great. What else do you need? Well, we need a location for it. Great, I'll get you that. So what's a reasonable time frame for you to get this task force together? Well, I think I can do it in a couple of weeks. So you can see where I'm going with this. I keep using this method of inquiry to help him solve his own problem. And so all of you are going to be leaders one day. And it's a really, really good skill to use this method of inquiry. Developing this method of inquiry skill will save you because you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to have all the questions. So in the end, what happened was he formed the task force, and he brought me back feedback on the task force. And then I brought it to the leadership group as a whole, and then we muddled around on what to do with it as a leadership group, and then we brought it back to more staff members because it was too small of a group to make the change. So we brought it back to more and more staff members and got more and more feedback. And Dan, did the attendance policy actually change? And I'm really happy to hear that the attendance policy changed because this was around the time I was transitioning out. So that makes me really happy. Did they abolish the credit policy entirely? Yes, that's what I recommended at the end also, because there was no way to make it fair. But the actual group came to that decision on their own, and that's what they recommended. So it worked out pretty well. So using this method of inquiry over and over and over again, taking the monkey off of your back and giving it to someone else to carry around. I'm going to consult my notes now. One of the things that is really important in your career and in your life generally, whether it's at work or outside of work, is to question authority. You've probably heard lots of people say that, and you probably think you're already doing it and you're pretty good at it. But when it comes to a work situation, sometimes it doesn't feel safe to question authority. Sometimes it feels like maybe you might get in trouble for questioning authority. It's the way you go about questioning authority that's important. So an issue comes up, and the best way to respond to it from a leadership perspective is to examine the pros and cons of whatever this problem is. And then present those pros and cons about the problem with a solution in mind. So make a recommendation based on your pros and cons. It's not okay to just question and question and question for the sake of questioning. Then you're just a pain in the ass. Pardon me, Lord. So I went to Catholic school too, so I always have to be really careful about what I say. But the point of it is, I'll give you a concrete example, literally a concrete example. I'm in the process of building this store over in the Kenton neighborhood, and the city of Portland said, hey, you have to change the whole sidewalk in the front of the building to meet the new code, which says you have to raise up the curb to a certain number of inches and blah, 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 blah. And most people would probably take the city at face value. But I don't really take anything at face value the first go-around. So I said, well, why do I have to do that? Well, it's code. Well, tell me about the code in terms of how it's applied evenly. Does everybody have to do it? Well, yeah, everybody has to do it. I said, okay, well, I'll look into this and I'll get back to you. So I went around to the businesses that were surrounding my site, and there happened to be a Walgreens next door to my site that had just signed a lease a few years ago and did their improvements. And their curb was exactly in the same condition as my curb. And they didn't do any improvements to their curb. And don't get me wrong, I'm really happy to pay my fair share of expenses to make things safe and so on. But if you're just doing something for the point of what I don't know, from no point, then it doesn't make any sense to me. So I went around to Walgreens and I went up and down the street and I came back to the city with photos. And I said, here's the photo of the sidewalk by the Walgreens and here's the one down the street. And the city said, oh, I see, well you can file an appeal. Great. How much does that cost? Well, it costs $250. Okay, what happens after I file the appeal? Well, if you win that one, you get to fill out another appeal and take it to the next level. I said, well, then what happens? Well, then there's another appeal process. So there were these 3 steps to this process, and I was kind of scratching my head, and I like to play this. You guys are all too young to remember Columbo, right? So Columbo's this detective that wears a raincoat, and he actually kind of like scratches his head, and he uses a method of inquiry like he's an idiot, you know, like, oh, geez, I don't know, that doesn't seem right. And so that's what I do when I go down to the city, you know, I scratch my head and I say, I don't know, that doesn't seem right. And so I filed the first appeal, and I showed them all my stuff, and they said, we agree. So I didn't have to go through that whole process of getting a whole new sidewalk. I'm going to take out some parts of it that don't drain correctly and that aren't safe, but I don't have to do the whole thing. So what I'm telling you is to question authority, but do it really smartly. One of my friends the other day said to me, she's a business owner, and she said to me, well, what do you do when a staff member comes to you and questions your behavior or your actions in a meeting? And I said, well, wait a minute, did they question your behaviors and actions in the meeting or outside of the meeting? And she said, outside of the meeting, afterward. And I said, well, I listen. And she said, oh, you're one of those kind of leaders. And I said, yeah, actually, because generally speaking, if you understand a person's intention, you know that they're not out to get you. They're generally out to do well for the business. That's usually their intention. So I said, what do you think that person's intention was when she shared her feedback with you about that meeting? And she said, well, I think her intention was good, that she really wanted me to know that I didn't handle that meeting particularly well and that we lost the client because of the way she handled the meeting. I said, oh, I think that's really important feedback. So what I say to you is try to understand people's intention. When they're giving you feedback 9 times out of 10, at least, their intention is good. And that 1 time out of 10 when their intention is bad, just listen, write it down, and say thanks. That's all you have to do. So as you're leading people in your life, you'll have opportunities where you can encourage feedback. And not only should you encourage feedback, you should require feedback. Because every decision you make in your life will be a better decision if more people have thought about it with you. I'll give you an example of that. So a few years ago at New Seasons, we had a big disparity. This was when the economy went in the toilet. Some argue that the economy is still in the toilet, but I think it might be around the rim by now. So when the economy went like this, like most companies, New Seasons suffered also. And sales went down from a 10%, double-digit comping when you're comparing sales this year over last year. So 10% growth year over year to 0. So it dropped 10% at least. I don't know, do the math for me, Jim. Was that a 10% or a 20% drop? So anyway, sales went flat. And sales went like this, but labor, what we paid to our employees was still way, way up here. And so what happened in the business world when sales were down here and labor was up here? Yeah, people got, their hours got cut, they got laid off. And so we were faced with this big disparity, and it was almost $1 million in sales. It was actually $875,000 in sales. And we were faced with the first time having to potentially lay off staff members and cut staff members' hours. And never in the history of New Seasons Market had we done this. So I thought, well, how can we solve this problem? Where we got to was I went to the board of directors and I said, hey, you guys, I'd really like to go back out to staff to try to help us solve this problem, because this is a really big deal. And I bet they're going to have the best ideas about how we solve this problem. And they said, okay, but we want you to know that if in 3 months you haven't solved the problem, we're going to have to consider other actions, meaning that we might have to consider cutting people's hours or laying them off. So I went back to our staff and I said, hey, you guys, we have this problem. Sales are down here, labor's up here. We don't want to lay anyone off, and we don't want to cut anyone's hours. What are we going to do? Staff members voluntarily said, hey, you know what? I don't have to work a full 40 hours. I'm good with 24 right now. And some other staff members said, well, you know what? That store over there on the other side of town, their deli department has too few people, and my deli department has too many people. So how about if I go over there? And then we can balance our labor like that. And so this went on for, the whole brainstorming session, a couple hours of just really great ideas. And I brought those ideas back to the board, and they said, great, let's try it. So the biggest decisions should actually be informed by the people who are going to be affected by those decisions. I don't know if you guys saw a couple weeks ago, Yahoo decided that people couldn't work from home anymore. And they all had to start reporting to the office. And I thought, I bet they didn't do that. I bet they didn't actually go back to their staff and say, here's the problem we're trying to solve. Let's get together and brainstorm it together and figure out what we can do. It sounded like a really top-down decision to me based on what I read. I don't know the whole thing, but that's more or less what I read. And so your outcomes are way, way better when you lead the company, quote unquote, from the bottom up. But there's something about feedback that you have to remember when you ask for it. And that is, you asked for it. So my daughter plays volleyball. I'm 5'1", and my daughter's 5'10" and a half now. And she lords over me. She's 16 years old. And she's all up in my grill, that's what she said. But it was interesting because she was sharing with me, she's the middle blocker on her volleyball team, and she was sharing with me an experience she had with her coach the other day. And her coach did something really cool, or at least I thought it was really cool. And that was, her coach said, "How am I doing as your coach?" I was like, wow, coaches don't typically ask that. And she said, because I want to make sure that I'm being the best coach I can for this team. And so each player went around and kind of said, well, you know, it would be great if maybe you could praise us a little bit more, and right in the moment, you know, don't wait till later, because we need to get that instant feedback so we know to do that again. And so the coach said, oh, I do that all the time. And then the next player had some feedback for her about how sometimes she scolds everyone in the moment. And she said, I'm very encouraging. So on one hand, she did something really good, which was ask for feedback. But on the other hand, she defended everything she did, as opposed to really listening, seeking first to understand, and then just saying thank you and taking it in. Like, write it down and take it in. And then you have time to come back later and potentially rationalize. But that's the whole thing. If you ask for feedback, you have to be prepared to receive the feedback, and then later to act on the feedback. I'm going to leave you with two more thoughts on leadership. An attorney, I was reading this in I get this daily Harvard business alert, and it's sort of like the tip for the day from the Harvard Business School. And since I could never go to the Harvard Business School, I figured I might as well get that daily tip. So one of the tips a few weeks ago came from a woman leader, and she said, whatever you do, don't ever cry at work. I was like, I am screwed. Because I've cried at work a whole bunch, and maybe not a whole bunch, but enough to feel really embarrassed, because you just can't help it when those tears like break out. But the people that I've cried in front of have been so incredibly gracious and graceful about it that it made me feel like it was no different than if I was laughing in front of them. And so I took that from my mentors along the way, that you have to give people that space to be emotional, because we are emotional. That's what separates us from animals. Maybe you believe your animal's emotional, I don't know. But typically, giving people that space to be emotional. Maybe they come in and they pound the table and they're really mad. Give them that space to be mad for a minute. Give them that space to cry for a minute. It's on the spectrum of emotional behavior that's expected. So that's one thing. I come from a fairly large Polish Catholic family. Both sets of my grandparents were from Poland, and both sets worked incredibly hard and instilled that work ethic into both of my parents. And when I was a kid growing up, we didn't have a choice. I grew up in the Midwest where there's a lot of snow. And we didn't have a choice but to work. It was just, that's what we did. It was part of our, family ethos, if you will. But I'm really thankful that I had that experience with my family, because what it enabled me to do is not be a whiner about hard work. I've noticed in my career that there are some people, say there's a group of 10 people that run a department in a grocery store. I would say 4 or 5 of those people at best are the ones doing the work, and the other 5 are running laps around the store talking about the party they went to last night or are going to tonight. And so obviously those people that are doing laps around the store are not the people that are going to be looked upon for a promotion. And the only way you're going to get promoted is if you work really, really hard and don't complain about it. That's just all there is to it. When I hire people, I try to hire people from the Midwest, and I like to hire farm kids, because farm kids work really, really hard. And unfortunately, you guys are a generation, and my daughter's generation kind of grew up with parents that are really nice and tell you that you're really smart and really beautiful and I love you about 100 times a day. That's how I actually parent my kid, and so I'm probably setting her up for failure. Although we did live on a farm, so maybe I balanced it out with the farm work. But anyway, don't expect that someone's going to pat you on the back. It's just not going to happen. And if you're going to work because you want people to praise you, it's not going to happen. So just do it because it gives you personal pride to work your butt off. It just feels really good. And the last thing is, every day I walk around with love in my heart. If I'm having a bad day, I still have love in my heart, and it enables me to be grateful for everything in my life and to be really thankful. Hardship or not, bad day or not, if you're walking around with love in your heart and you're leading others with that love, it can be felt. And so I think if you get all those things in the mix that we talked about, you're going to be incredibly successful in your careers, and I would love to hire you. I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you for listening. Yes?
I'm just kind of curious, today when you are going from Page,
Yeah.
and you have that article in the Portland Business Alliance also sent out a mailing to people about jobs, white men, 25 to 39, I can't remember, but just about how in Portland, I guess, I'm not sure, I mean, it was a very problematic thing to read, and I don't understand statistics, but as a person that has run businesses and is opening up this new enterprise, did you get a chance to see the article?
I didn't see the article.
Okay.
However, I think I know what you're driving at. So it sounds to me like you're driving at that young men are disproportionately able to get jobs, and maybe women are.
No,
Is that what it was, or just the opposite?
It's a very bizarre article, and the study seems to be, I mean, but I'm not a statistician, but essentially that men aren't working as hard as they should.
Men are not.
Men are not, and that this is costing the city of Portland lots of revenue. And yeah, it was on the front page of the Oregonian, and also I think saying that, you know, if you're a humanities major, you know, that's a big problem too. The Portland Business Alliance had a different perspective on this. It was more about.
That's hard for me to respond to, only because I didn't read it and I have no idea if men work harder than women. But I can tell you that early in my career, when I was a chef, I was the only woman in the kitchen. And in order to gain the respect of the guys in the kitchen, you actually do have to work harder and smarter than them. And for the guys in the kitchen, it was actually, they got dissed if I had to come over and dig them out of the weeds. They would say stuff like, hey, girl chef had to come over and dig you out, ha ha ha. So like that to me was a badge of honor because I was moving my way up. So I think that's probably true if I'm getting the taste of what you're trying to say, that in some cases women do have to work harder to get the same maybe notice that a guy does. But I don't know if that's what the article was.
Well, I just think the article also saying is the productivity of people in this age range, adequate? I think that was the question. Are we living in a society, particularly this region, that people are not working to their full potential?
Yes, that's absolutely true. People do not work to their full potential. I've seen it a million times. Yeah, sometimes just doing as little as they can to get by. So yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's why I said I like to hire people from the Midwest and kids that have worked on farms. No offense, when you guys get out there, you're just going to have to work that much harder to get ahead, because I've seen it. I've seen kids just trying to do a little bit to get by. So yeah, I do agree with that. Sorry you guys, I didn't mean to be insulting. Hi.
Can you speak a little bit to the mentors that maybe you had along the way that kind of delve through your leadership philosophy and kind of what you really learned from one of these?
Yeah, sure. So the question was around who my mentors were. Early on in my cooking career, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of different chefs, and one of those chefs was Julia Child. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm like this big, and was this big. But what was really memorable for me about working with her was her generosity about food. In the 80s, that was when food was just starting to, be more than a broiled pork chop and some applesauce and broccoli, which is what my mom burned every night. And so the 80s were when the celebrity chefs were kind of coming up, and a lot of the celebrity chefs were kind of like Gordon Ramsay. Like literally, they would throw stuff and they would swear at you and they would be really angry. And that's not what food was about for me. It was about sharing, and it was about celebrating in people's lives. And so when I worked with Julia Child, one of the things that she brought forward was this sense of grace and generosity and sharing. And she also was very efficient in the kitchen. She had very few wasted movements. She was thoughtful about how she set up her workstation so that she didn't have to walk way over there and then way over here and be inefficient. And so that was one. Another one was when I was at Whole Foods, I had a mentor who was, this was when I was on the purchasing team, and I had a tendency to be a little bit of a punk when I was younger. And well, if anybody a punk in the room, you know what I mean? But I'm just kidding. Okay, so I kind of thought I knew more than everybody else, and I wasn't always the most collegial staff member when I was young. And through this method of inquiry, this mentor got me to understand that my style was not working. And so he kept saying to me, like if I brought something up, like I would say, oh, that guy's a jerk and I'm done with him. I want to fire him. He would say, well, what do you mean you want to fire him and you're done? Have you talked to him about the things that you're having trouble with? Oh man, I've talked to him 20 times. I'm so done with that guy. He'd say, well, let's go look in his employee file and see what's in there. Oh, I've documented like crazy. And so we'd go into his employee file, and of course nothing's in there. And he'd say, oh, looks like we have an opportunity to maybe document and put it on an action plan and start over. I'd be like, that's gonna take forever. I'm just done with that guy now. And so he taught me that I needed to be more patient, that I needed to be more thoughtful, that I needed to use this method of inquiry, and it stuck. So he was a great mentor, and I still talk to him all the time. In fact, he's an investor in my business, and he still uses that method of inquiry to grill me pretty much every other day. Other questions? Yeah, Peter.
Hey, Lisa, as companies go from startup to getting quite big, going from 250 to 2,500, companies tend to become more corporate. And obviously, New Seasons has evolved. What would you do in your company that you're starting out with to prevent that from becoming too corporate potentially down the road?
I totally agree with that. Most companies start out pretty good, and then as they get bigger, they create a lot of stupid rules. And that was something I learned from another mentor of mine, which was Brian Roeder, the founder of New Seasons Market, who hired me many years ago. And that is, don't put in a lot of stupid rules. Trust people and trust their judgment. And if you're gonna put a rule in place, make sure it's not a reactive rule. Like someone's stealing at one store, a staff member was stealing, and someone else said, well, why don't we just make sure we search everyone's bags every night before they leave? And I was like, well, why would we want to penalize the 98% of everyone who's not stealing for the 2% that do steal? Like, that's just stupid. So we didn't do that. And so not having a lot of stupid rules is kind of the basis of culture in my mind. And then the other thing that I was talking about earlier was that bottom-up piece of it, because the people that are on the front lines that are doing the work every day know way more than you do because they're talking to the customers every single day. And then the other thing about culture is you actually have to ask people how you're doing. are we living up to our values? Please rate this. It looks corporate when you ask people to rate something, but actually when you get the results back, and you need to publish the results. So one example of publishing the results was we did an annual culture survey so that every single staff member had the opportunity to say, here's how we think you're doing with regard to culture and values. And we literally published every comment. And some people said really harsh things like, yeah, you talk a lot, but you don't walk the talk. And you won't change things and hold people accountable because you don't have the cojones to do that. And we published everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, which gives you credibility. And it also means that people are going to speak up again because we published it so transparently. So I think that idea of being very transparent in your communications and not being afraid to get the feedback, and then going back and saying, okay, now what do we do with this feedback? So that seems to work really well. And I think we were really successful at it at New Seasons in terms of maintaining the company culture as we grew. And I think they're going to continue to be that way. So there's a lot of good things I learned there that I'll apply to my business. Thanks for asking. Yeah?
How do you think your leadership is going to change now that you're an entrepreneur and I guess failing isn't an option?
Thanks for saying that. Failing is not an option. I can tell you that it becomes a little more clipped. I don't have time for long, lengthy sessions of method of inquiry. It's kind of just one. What do you think the solution to that is? It's really crazy, the whole startup thing. It's way crazier than I thought it was going to be, even from watching the Facebook movie. I thought, well, that'll be good. I'll watch that and see how that goes. He didn't really seem to be working that hard, if you ask me. Boy, I wish I could answer that question better, but that's the best I can do right now, is that everything is like much more brief. And because 5 people are doing the jobs of like 20 people right now. But what I want to do, what's really important to me, in the very first day, I have 5 staff members right now. And I have a marketing director, I have a CFO, I have a produce director, and I have a grocery buyer. And the very first day of all of us being together was 2 weeks ago. And as part of that very first day, we started reading a book called Good to Great, which maybe you guys have read. I think it's one of the best business books out there. And I also gave them a copy of a book called Servant Leadership. And so we're reading about that. And then we did mission, vision, values work together on the very first day. How are we going to behave as zebrans out in the world? And we talked about how important it was to be transparent in our communications, to be transparent in our supply chain with our customers. We talked about being respectful and trustworthy. So we did all that on our very first day of forming the business. So hopefully that will help a lot. Any other questions? Yes?
So I know the part of, I think that was really good, but part of what your concept is to try to address some of the issues which happen all over the United States, but in this particular region, of looking at food deserts and looking at, what can you do to, increase nutrition, and also get people into your store. And a lot of what people do, in our city, of course, is to do public involvement, try to communicate with people who will be using the service or product. And I was wondering, how much of that you are taking into consideration as you do your store placement, your products, and how you feel you're going to serve and include people that you're trying to reach out to.
Yeah, great. So if I heard you correctly, it was asking about how we're going to be involved in the community as a business. And one of the big pieces of us being involved in the community is that we're asking the community what they want to see in their store. We're closing the loop on conversations we have on social media. You guys probably know this already, but you can actually get a 4-year degree in social media. Who knew? I just found that out recently. And I think it's a great degree to get because there's so much more to discover as we go forward in this way of communicating, because we have one-way conversations oftentimes, or at least from a website perspective. Well, I'll give you an example. So, this Facebook example. We asked customers what kind of coffee they like the most. And they said, well, I like Nosa Familia, I like Stumptown, I like Happy Cup, blah, 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 blah. And we could have just left that question, you know, out there and never responded back other than a thank you. But instead, we took all the feedback and we analyzed it, and we put it in a pie chart, and we saw that Nosa Familia was #1, Stumptown was #2, Happy Cup was #3, and we published it back on our Facebook page so everybody could see what was going on. So I feel like there's this opportunity as you use these social media tools to communicate in more depth and thinking about what that relevance is. But beyond that, I attended the Woodstock, or I'm sorry, we're opening 2 stores at once. One's Woodstock and one's Kenton. But we attended the Kenton Neighborhood Association and the Kenton Business Association recently. And from that meeting, I had a whole bunch of people come up to me and say, hey, you know what, I'm a planter, I'm a landscape architect, I'm a guy that does salvage wood products, I'd love to find a way to work with you. And so I said, great, let's sit down and talk. So today I met with them, and the landscape person is helping us build these planter boxes, and the planter boxes are going to contain herbs. Not herb, but herbs. And they're going to be free to the neighborhood, so anybody can come by and clip some chives or some basil and take it home. And we talked about creating habitat in the planter boxes so that we're encouraging pollination and bees and all kinds of things. And we're going to plant dwarf fruit trees instead of just trees, so that, you know, neighbors can actually go and pick fruit. So I got some really great feedback from the neighborhood and the people that are working and living in it. So we'll be really deeply involved in the local community to a point of a micro-local. I know that sounds extra precious, micro-local. But the point of it is that we want to be an incubator for neighborhood businesses in every one of our locations. So that's kind of where we're going with that. Did I miss another part of your question?
It's good, but I think people don't realize nationally, really, the great issue that people are actually addressing is the fact that how many places all over our country have all these, you know, we have so much programming, so many special marketing, and there are still, you know, deserts in our country where there are no good people and no good food. And
Yeah.
what they're dealing with, I think your concept of trying to deal with the, you know, the black pantry concept of coming in quickly, in, out, done, is what really needs to be addressed, but it has to be addressed in neighborhoods other than ones that are already found.
Right, right. So, you know, most convenience stores make their sales revenues on the purchase of cigarettes and beer and Slurpees and nachos with liquid meat. I actually went to a 7-Eleven and there was a nacho machine, and you pull down the lever and liquid meat comes out. I was like, oh my God. So imagine what that's doing to your body. So we are definitely working hard to change that food landscape. I wouldn't say that anywhere in Portland is particularly a food desert, but that's because I grew up in Detroit. I think there are underserved areas, but I don't think there are actual deserts. The deserts are in the deserts. So when you think about Eastern Oregon and other places in Oregon where there are almost no food options, what I'm hoping is that there might be a public-private partnership where you know, they can help me, they being the public entity like the government, can help me offset operating losses through grants, because I'll never make those stores profitable unless we partner together, because there's just not enough volume. So I'm going to try to do a bunch of different things to bring health to other communities as well. Any other questions? Yeah?
How can a group of employees encourage organizations to embrace a bottom to top approach?
The question was, how can a group of employees get together and influence the bottom-up approach? What I've said to people in the past is get that group of employees together and let people in management know you're doing this so it doesn't feel like a coup. And say, hey, you know what, we have some ideas, because this goes back to intention. Your intention is that you want the company to be better. And so start there. Our intention is that we want this company to be the best it can be. And so we're going to get a group of staff members together, and we want to bring a proposal to you on how we think we can improve the company culture. We think the results of that will be higher sales and higher retention. So give them some numbers that they can chew on. And then do it as a proposal, because you'll get their attention in a really positive way. Yes?
What were your biggest challenges transitioning from one job to the next?
This last job to this job? Or just generally?
General.
I went from working for Whole Foods in the 90s when their stock price was going like this. And so nobody ever said to me, hey, you're spending too much money on that particular decor package for a new store. Like, ever. There was no budget for new stores. And then I worked for Whole Foods for many years, and then I went to go work for a startup in Boulder. And then all of a sudden it was every single penny we spent was scrutinized. And I was, oh my God, I don't know how to do this. So that was a big culture shock. And I would say the way I tried to get around that big culture shock, it was maybe a money shock, was to go back to the vendors and try to figure out ways where I could creatively wring dollars out of the system so that I could use them to, meet my goals. With this particular job right now, there's nothing in the whole world that could have prepared me for how many hours it is and how crazy it is. But I will also tell you that when you realize set a goal for yourself, like maybe you want to run a half marathon. I should pick something that I want to do. I'll never do that. Maybe I'm going to try to cook 5 nights a week for my daughter. And you set that goal. And you hit that goal, and your kid hands you the plate after you cook for them, and it's empty, and they're completely happy. You're like, yeah, that feels really good. I set a goal, realized the goal, I'm really happy. But when you have a dream, a long-held dream, and you get to fulfill that dream, it's unbelievably rewarding, 100 times more. And I feel so thankful and privileged and happy, and it's awesome. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question very well. Thank you for asking.
Maybe one last question back there. Last question.
Yes.
A little different tact, and perhaps this is the wrong venue to vet this particular issue, but I wanted to ask you if you feel that ageism in today's workplace is an issue. Perhaps as an homage to your comments about leadership, community, and transparency. As a corporation, how do you...
Yes, I do. I think ageism is a big problem. There have been staff members in the past that I thought were incredible, but they were overlooked by their younger leaders because they were thought of as maybe not being robust enough to take on whatever that position's responsibilities were. And they were so overlooked that they never even asked. They never even considered that person. And I think it's a really relevant question because there's going to be more and more people. The retirement age today, there was a story on NPR about extending the retirement age. And the nice thing about having people that are 50 and over in the workplace is you get to learn from them. They know so much more than we do. I'm pushing 50 now, so I don't know what that means for me, but I do think there's ageism, and I do think there's opportunities to train around ageism and to make people aware that it's really prevalent, because I've seen it happen a lot of times.
All right, well,
Good?
thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, you guys.